So hi, everybody. Thanks for posting your names and affiliations in the chat. We are at 2 o'clock, so I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and get started. So welcome to the Midwest Migration Network's virtual meeting series. So this is the second week in the series. Last week, the Banding and Ground Survey Initiative met, and so this week, for the next 2 hours, we're going to hear about radar and acoustic studies that are happening in the Great Lakes region. And next week will be the Telemetry and Modus Initiative group, and the final week will be the Great Lakes Wind and Wildlife Coalition. So I hope you will participate in the other sessions after today as well. And so there's a link you've registered to the meeting, you can register for those other sessions as well. And just by way of introducing ourselves, I'm Jeff Bueller. I'm a professor of wildlife ecology at the University of Delaware, and I am the chair of the Radar and Acoustics Initiative for the Midwest Migration Network. So I'm going to be sort of hosting or moderating the session today. And so just a little bit of housekeeping. You've probably already been asked to whether you to acknowledge that the program's being recorded, and there will be a link going out later. And maybe Stephanie, if you could maybe post that in the chat. There will be a YouTube link for the recordings. And I just ask that you please mute yourself while the speakers are talking, and you can feel free to unmute yourself to ask questions or raise a hand or post a question in the chat. I'll be moderating the chat for questions. And yeah, so let's see. So this is the agenda for today. It's going to be basically a series of presentations on various research projects happening in the region. And so hopefully speakers have left time for questions within their time slot. So they're about 15 minutes apiece. So I guess we can go ahead and get started. I'm going to stop my share. And I think the speakers should have co-host ability. It looks like, let's see, is everyone here? For those of you that are also listed as Jeff Bueller, we're going to need you to change your name to your real name. So we'll know who's who, because I think some of you are also presenters. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Our first speaker today is going to be Sergio Cabrera Cruz with the Instituto de Ecología in the state of Veracruz, Mexico. And he's going to be talking about, I can find my agenda. Exposure of night migrating birds to collision risk with anthropogenic structures around the Great Lakes. So go ahead, Sergio, you can unmute yourself and share your screen.
All right, you can hear me and see my slides, I hope.
Yes.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you, Jeff, for the invitation and for introducing me. And hello, everyone. Well, I'm Sergio, and I'm going to talk about, as Jeff said, some work that we're doing to evaluate the vulnerability and the exposure of night migrating birds to collision risk with different structures.
Sergio?
Yes.
Sorry, we can see your notes as well.
Oh, can you? Oh, that's a bummer. All right, well, I'm gonna close that. All right, as you know, aerial animals share the lower airspace with anthropogenic structures. And as this figure shows on the right, on the left, it shows multiple different flight altitudes of aerial animals. And on the right, it shows the different structures that could pose a threat to these animals at different altitudes. But as you all also know, the night migrating birds, as this plot of the vertical distribution of night migrating birds show, if night migrating birds can overlap with the distribution or heights of structures, anthropogenic structures. For example, as the data from the Cleveland radar shows around the Great Lakes, nocturnal migrants during the night, at some hours of the night, can overlap with the heights of wind turbines. This is some work that a collaborator just published. And so bird densities can overlap during the night with these heights. And so that means that birds that are flying low can be exposed to collision with some structures such as wind turbines. And also, as you also know, migrating birds spend most of the time during migration on the ground, resting and refueling, so they make frequent stops. And we think that it is during this transition between the aerial and terrestrial habitats that may be more vulnerable or more exposed to risk of collision. Also, bird mortality during migration is pretty significant, and just in the US and Canada alone, more than 3 billion birds are estimated to die from human-related causes every year. And an important proportion of this number is related to collisions with structures. So structures actually represent a threat to birds during migration. And we define vulnerability precisely as the exposure to threats, or more specifically, as the exposure to threats or the collision risk, the risk of collision with structures when the birds are taking off. And that's specific for this work where we used weather radars. And we asked where in the landscape are birds vulnerable to threats or to collision risk with structures. So we created a map that shows the scored risk of collision with 6 different structures. And having a map like this allows to answer different questions that are also interesting or more interesting than just knowing the spatial distribution for threats in the landscape. As you know, we typically assume that urban areas represent the highest or have the highest threat levels to birds during migration, and that is because they represent such drastic alterations of the landscape. However, there are also some threats or some structures such as wind turbines that are almost exclusive to non-urban areas, and such as wind turbines. And then we have networks of roads and power lines that cross vast extensions that are not only within urban areas. So we asked whether threat levels are higher in urban areas, and we predicted that yeah, this is the case. This has to be the case. So we expect to find higher threat levels in urban areas compared to non-urban areas. We also asked whether threats affect the distribution of birds. We know that bird distribution or bird density is affected by some perceived threats. Think, for example, of noise from highways and the Phantom Road experiment. And we predicted that the threat level in the landscape also is also related to bird densities in the landscape, so that the threat level is higher where there are lower threat levels. Another question that we had is whether threats affect the consistency of stopover areas. So some stopover areas are used consistently year after year, and this implies that birds like that place for some reason. And some other places are not used that regularly, so for some reason they don't use it that often. So we predicted that the variability of stopover use is highest where the threat level is also highest. So variability of stopover use implies a lower consistency or a low consistency of use of those areas. Finally, protected areas are so far designed to protect biodiversity on the ground and not so much for protecting biodiversity in the air, or in this case, migrating birds. And some threats such as airports or collisions with airplanes occur not only within the confines of the airports, but also when and mostly when the aircraft is in the air, outside of the airport environments. And there are some cases where collisions occur, potentially within protected areas. So we predicted that vulnerability should be lower in protected areas and higher in non-protected areas, but we wanted to test this. So of course, to answer these questions, and as I said, we first created the threatscape, which is a map of threat levels with the scored risk of collision from all these 6 different structures. And for example, for the risk of collision with airports, we used the line features of operational airport runways, and we modeled the altitude of bird collisions with or bird strikes with aircraft from 2 different airport types using published data. And then we estimated the flight altitudes of aircraft up to the altitudes were up to 99% of the bird strikes occur with aircraft. We combined these 2 elements to then create the risk areas around airports. And we assume that, well, we know that airplanes can depart or land from either side of the runway. So that's why we have like these areas to both sides of the runways, which are here in the center. And then we also assume that aircraft can not be aligned with the runways by up to 10 degrees from the runways when they are departing or taking off or landing. And that's why they have this shape that the area is wider at the edges and narrower at the runways where the airplanes actually are on the ground. But then not all airports are the same or equal. So we weighted the expected mortality, the expected number of collisions by the yearly number of aircraft operations at each airport. For wind turbines and communication towers, we got data from the US wind turbine database and from the Federal Aviation Administration, respectively. And we created circular buffers around each of these features that has a radius equal to the distance that a bird would need to start flying from in order to fly over the structures if it's flying in the direction of the structures. With that a set angle that we took from some publication. And then we assigned the expected mortality based on the annual number of fatalities by megawatts in the case of wind turbines for region in the US. And for communication towers, we got it from we assigned mortality based on the annual bird mortality by tower according to their height category. And we took a similar level of detail for all the other threats, and I'm not going to give all the details here, just for the sake of time. I'm happy to talk about it later. But when we have all these layers, we combine them just by summing the expected mortality or the threat level into a single layer that is the final threatscape that represents the risk of collision with structures. We did this work for the whole continuous United States. And so this final map, this threadscape represents the risk of collision with structures. And this map has a 30-meter resolution for the whole country. For bird density, we used data from 7 radars around the Great Lakes for 4 years, spring and autumn. And basically, the way that radars in general work is that the radar antennas emit a electromagnetic beam that gets reflected when it's it gets affected by objects that it detects in the air, in the case of birds, and the atmosphere. And that information is used to then estimate the density of the objects detected, like bird densities. Since we measure bird densities in the air around each radar for multiple years, we could get a measure of the variability of those densities. So that, as I said before, when the densities were consistently high during multiple years, that gave a low variability, representing that the area was used consistently. But when the densities were variable over years, it gave a high variability, or all the variability in this case, high variability, representing that the area was not used consistently throughout the years. We estimated bird vulnerability just by combining the bird densities that we got from the radars times the threat level or score from the threatscape, and that's how we obtained the vulnerability, as we can see in this example for the Chicago radar. We obtained urban and protected areas geospatial information from the Census Bureau and the protected areas database from the US. And we extracted all this information, the bird densities and threat levels and protected areas and urban areas into grids with 100 meter square cells. And that's where we estimated the variability at this scale. We estimated the relationship between threat levels and vulnerability with urban areas and protected areas using these two as predictors binary, but also using radar as a random effect. We use generalized additive mixed models. And for our models of bird densities and variability of stopover use, we also included the threat level as another predictor. Remember that for the threat levels, we predicted that it would be lower at urban areas and higher at urban areas. What we found is that threat levels are actually higher at urban areas and lower at non-urban areas. And within those categories, threats are comparatively lower at protected areas for both urban and non-urban areas. So it seems that protection at around the Great Lakes is reducing the threat level for birds. And so there's a nice gradient where the threat level increases as the level of urbanization increases, but also as the level of not protection or lack of protection also increases. For bird densities, we predicted that densities would be higher at low threat levels and lowest at high levels of threat. During the autumn season, which is like this reddish line, we found that threat level is relatively constant from bird densities are constant from low to mid-high levels of threat. But then for the autumn, it increases with threat level, and then for both seasons, bird densities decline with the highest level of threat. So this is similar to what we predicted, but it only applies or almost only applies with the cases of the highest level of threat. Bird densities decline with the highest levels of threat. For variability of stopover use, we predicted that variability would be higher with the highest levels of threat, indicating lower consistency of stopover area use. What we found for the autumn was that it was also the variability of stopover use, or the consistency of stopover use, was consistent throughout the lowest to the mid-high levels of threat. And then the variability increased with the highest levels of threat, suggesting again that with the highest threat levels, the consistency of stopover use reduces. For spring, we found that the variability of stopover use decreases for all the threat levels, and this indicates that the consistency of stopover use actually increases, and that's not what we expected. For vulnerability, we predicted that it would be lower at protected areas and highest at non-protected areas. What we found again is that vulnerability is certainly higher at urban areas. Birds are more vulnerable to collisions or to threats at urban areas. And it's highest at not protected areas within urban areas, and it is lowest at protected areas in non-urban areas. So as a summary, the threat levels, we found that threat levels are higher in urban areas and they are lower in protected areas. And for vulnerability, we also found the same thing. Birds are more vulnerable in urban areas and less vulnerable in protected areas. For bird densities, we found that they decline with the highest levels of threat. And for variability of stopover use, we found that it varies by season, and we need to explore this more. Maybe this difference is just due to the phenology of migration in different boat seasons. But then we have reasons to believe that it might vary locally around each radar because there are some differences in the amount of protected areas or the amount of urbanization around each radar. So these are the preliminary results, and I'll take any questions if there are any, if there's time. But I'm also happy to talk later.
Yeah, I think we might need to save questions for Sergio until the end. Hopefully we'll have some time at the end maybe for some questions. So thanks, Sergio, that was great. So our next speaker is going to be Jennifer White, who's with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and she'll be talking about the Great Lakes Airspace Map Decision Support Tool. So Jennifer, if you want to go ahead and share your screen and unmute yourself.
Okay, hi everybody. Yeah, so this project actually is done by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'm actually now with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But I'll be talking about this project that was ongoing from 2011 to 2018. And with this Great Lakes Airspace Map Decision Support Tool, a number of predicted maps have been created from the data that was collected, both for nocturnally migrating birds and for bats. Okay, I'm trying to advance my screen. Okay, sorry folks. I'm not seeing an arrow to advance my screen. Oh, there it went. Okay. Yeah, so the service studied these birds using radar units from 2011 to 2018. And the idea was to identify bird habitat and bat habitat use in the air. And of course, both birds and bats need clear navigable flyways from the ground level up to high altitudes. And so these predicted areas are finding concentration areas during the nighttime in the airspace. And also this is connected to habitat use on the ground, at least during dawn when birds and bats are landing. So on the ground, both birds and bats need habitat to rest and roost. And of course, birds need high quality stopover habitat to refuel for migration. And then there's a lot of concern with development around the Great Lakes. So artificial light at night, for instance, can interfere with navigation, and it can increase collisions with buildings. And then wind turbines and communication towers are a collision threat for both birds and bats. So the service purchased 2 radar units. These are mobile and can be set out to study these nocturnal animals. They can be programmed to automatically collect data continuously throughout the migration period. They have 2 different antennas. One is a vertical radar antenna, and so this collects information from the ground level up to 2.8 kilometers, and it provides information on the altitude of migration, and also target count, so animal count. And then there's the horizontal radar, which collects information around the radar unit in a radius of 3.7 kilometers. And this provides information on the direction of travel. And then these units also track individual animals and create track plots. So we'll look at those next. Okay, so here we have an example of the vertical radar with track plots, and a track plot is an individual line here. So that's one individual animal that's being tracked. And so for nighttime migration here around midnight, you can see that the airspace is full from the ground level, about 150 meters, all the way up to 2.8 kilometers. And even though the airspace is full, there's still a really high density at lower altitude. So here about the 500 meter mark, and then below 250 meters here, where animals could come into contact with wind turbines. And then during the dawn time period, birds are lowering their altitude of flight as they land, ending nighttime migration. Here we have examples of horizontal track plots on the bottom of the screen for different time periods. And over here for the daytime period, this is tracking animals during the day. And here is a line indicating the difference between Cleveland to the south and Lake Erie to the north. And the dot here indicates where the radar unit is. There's also a color grid which shows you the direction of flight. So in this case, during the daytime, there's not nocturnal migration happening, and we don't have a lot of directionality to the flight indicated by this short red arrow here. During the dusk time period, what you see is animals taking off from the Cleveland area and heading west over Lake Erie as they take off for migration, and we have an increase in the directionality here going west. And then the nighttime migration, you can see there's strong directionality here to the southwest during the nighttime, and the numbers have increased a lot here. So this is an average, an hourly average over the night. So we have 9,000 targets flying towards the southwest per hour over the nighttime. And then during the dawn, there's still a high number of migrants flying during the dawn time period. And in this case, there's 4,000 heading towards south and southeast, and the directionality is south to southeast as they are flying over Lake Erie and then landing after they reach Cleveland. One thing to notice here is these black patches. So these are areas where there are migrants flying, but we're not able to see them because there's a blockage to the radar beam. And so this is because of ground clutter, so buildings or trees. And each site has a different pattern of ground clutter. And so this introduces site-by-site variation. Okay, so to create the predictive maps, these radar units were set out on each of the Great Lakes to monitor spring and fall migration. And so the circles here show where there were radar units, and the size of the circle shows the relative passage rates. So larger circles, greater passage. And so predictive maps were created from a target passage rate estimate at each of these sites along with covariates. And the covariates were land cover, nighttime light, proximity to the shoreline, and latitude and longitude. We have these predictive maps within the Great Lakes Airspace Map Decision Support Tool. And so this is the base map for this tool. It's in ArcGIS Online. And on the left-hand side here, you see the contents are a number of different layers. So we've put in a number of layers that we thought would be interesting or that people would be interested in for conservation purposes. We also have the bird radar layers and bat acoustic layers here. There's some functionality across the top, so you can add other layers that you might be interested in. You can save, share, and print maps. And in ArcGIS Online, I'm assuming that probably most people here online here would have access to this through their institution. So through work, you would be able to sign up for this. And one of the great things about it is that you can add collaborators. So this is a place where you can collaborate and share maps and data, and you can create groups. Okay. So one other thing that you have with ArcGIS Online is you have access to a number of different maps through ArcGIS Living Atlas. And so there's thousands of map layers here, but a lot of them, well, you could use a filter here. I filtered through, so I'm using the environment as a filter and species, and that gets us down to about 52 layers. So there's a lot of data here as well for critical habitat, invasive species, threatened and endangered species. So a number of different layers here that you could use. And so these are all different layers that you might use for conservation purposes. And here we have examples from the radar project. And this is the target passage rate for spring nighttime and also fall nighttime. And in this case, you've got this layer selected and opened up the legend so that you can interpret the map. And here, the target passage rate is being mapped along with the coefficient of variation. And so in this case, the bright blue areas are areas with high passage rate and low coefficient of variation. So here on the western edge of the Great Lakes Basin, this is an area where you could expect to have consistently high passage rates. And then on the other side of this color grid are the warmer colors or orange. And in this case, these are areas of low passage and high variation. And so we see that up in the Upper Peninsula in northern Michigan and the eastern portion of the basin. And then for the fall nighttime, you can see that the bright blue areas have shifted east. So southern Michigan, southern Lake Michigan, and western and southern Lake Erie are areas of high passage. Okay, so we have another way to look at passage rates, and this is the window passage rate. And so in this case, the area of high passage and low variation is shown with this bright pink color. And so in this case, you can see that there's a lot of areas that are showing up bright pink. And so we can compare that with the fall. So in similarity, this southern Michigan area is similar to the fall nighttime target passage rate. But there's a little bit more assurance here that there might be higher passage rates in northern Wisconsin and northern Michigan. So what the window passage rate is it is a subset of the target passage rate. And in this case, this subset is looking at clear windows, so windows that don't have ground clutter. And so this removes a lot of that site-by-site variation. So it's another way you can try and get an idea of the amount of passage in different areas. Okay, so the decision support tool is made with many different layers. So you can scale it from really large base layers up to very specific layers. And again, the idea with this is that you would be able to use these different layers, including the avian radar and bat layers, to help identify places that you might want to work for restoration or conservation purposes. And so in this case, at the very base, you could use things like canopy cover, land cover, or impervious surface cover. And then, of course, there's the radar and acoustic data layers as well. And then there's a number of public data layers like ArcGIS Online, the Living Atlas. And then at the top here, this is where you might include your own location or treatment layers and collaborate with groups in a given region or area. So here's an example using the spring dawn time period. In this case, we're looking at, this is Saginaw Bay in Michigan. And so for the spring dawn time period, you can see that this is a bright blue. So this is an indication that this is an important area for birds as they're landing, ending nighttime migration. And then we can add other public layers. And in this case, we've added the Audubon important bird area layer for water birds. And this is purple. And so this is an indication that this is a globally important area for water birds. Another public layer that I've added here is protected areas by manager type. And so this is a nice one for seeing all the areas that are protected, finding out who owns these different areas for potential areas to work or collaboration, and then also just visualizing restoration projects. Okay, so I'd like to acknowledge the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and EPA for funding, and DTECT for support with the radar units, and then a number of different parks and many private landowners hosted the radar units. And I'd like to thank you for your time. And also here is the website for the Avian Radar Project, where you could get access to the tool and also a story map and see all the folks that have worked on this project over the years.
Okay.
I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, maybe time for one quick question. You can unmute yourself if you want to ask a question or post it in the chat. Okay. I'm not seeing any questions. So, well, thank you, Jennifer. That looks like a really useful tool, and hopefully you've got some users here in the audience that will take advantage of it.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right, so we'll move on to our next speaker is Yuting Deng, goes by Hermione from Colorado State University, and she will be talking about quantifying long-term phenological patterns of aerial insectivores roosting in the Great Lakes region using weather surveillance radar. So go ahead, Hermione, you can unmute yourself and share your screen.
Now you guys can see the screen, yeah?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, cool. Hi everyone, I'm Yuting Deng. I'm a PhD student at Colorado State University. So before I start, I would like to acknowledge my collaborators from University of Massachusetts Amherst and University of Oklahoma, as well as my coworkers in my lab and my advisor, Dr. Kyle Horton. So it is increasingly recognized that phenological change is a common response to climate change, and altered phenology has been documented in a variety of taxa across life stages. For example, this paper used more than 10,000 terrestrial and aquatic phenological dataset over 20 years in the UK to project estimated phenological shifts by 2050s. So here in the figure on the y-axis, we're seeing phenological shifts, and on the x-axis, we're seeing a variety of taxas. So for birds, they are to advance 2 to 4 days in different emission scenarios by 2050s. Another recent study on the nocturnal avian migration using weather surveillance radar, peak autumn migration timing has advanced at all flyways. And avian aerial insectivores population are experiencing acute declines among many bird groups, with species in Canada experiencing a 59% decline and a 32% decline in all North America since 1970s. Discerning the potential mechanism behind the decline is crucial, and one of which is the effect of climate change. While aerial insectivores breeding biology under a changing climate is widely studied, fewer research focus on their post-breeding and pre-migratory period. After the breeding season, swallows and martins of all ages in North America transition to pre-migratory roosts in late June and July. And in the northern United States, summer roosts of aerial insectivore species are largely composed of purple martins, but also include tree swallows, barn swallows, bank swallows, and cliff swallows. And they have very unique communal roosting behaviors. So each night around sunset before their full migration, they aggregate in large numbers at their nocturnal resting sites, some of which contain more than 100,000 birds. And here we are looking at a series of radar images. So around sunrise, these aerial insectivores emerge from their nightly roosting location and form these distinct morning exodus donut-shaped patterns, which you see are within these bounding boxes. So in the Great Lakes region, these roost rings populate radar images from late June to mid-September. The use of weather surveillance radar allowed us to understand this unique post-breeding and pre-migratory period of aerial insectivores' life history. So the goal of this study is to understand what are the phenological patterns of aerial insectivore roosting in the Great Lakes region. And do different stages of roosting have similar phenological patterns? And since air temperature has shown to influence some migratory timing events and may serve as a good proxy of aerial insect phenology, we also ask, is air temperature a good predictor of interannual variation in phenology? So first, a little bit background on how we use radar to collect roost emergence data. As swallows and martins emerge from their nightly roosting locations, radar is able to capture portions of the biological clusters that is within the scanning radar beams. And then we leverage a deep learning algorithm introduced by UMass team to automatically detect and track roost in radar scans. These are 5 consecutive radar reflectivity images from a radar station based at Detroit, Michigan on the morning of August 18th, 2005. And to ensure confidence in our detection, we manually screened all detections to remove false positives, including contaminations from precipitation and anomalous propagation. And from there, we were able to extract the number of birds within each roost bounding boxes by calculating a number density and radar sampling volume. For example, there are more than 48,000 birds within this one single roost. So overall, we extracted roost signals from 21 years of data across 12 radar stations throughout the Great Lakes region. And each of this range is a 150-kilometer buffer. We chose Great Lakes as the starting region for our project because the Great Lakes is an important ecoregion for millions of in-route migratory birds, and it is known that many insectivore species form pre-migratory roosts here. So after we acquired the number of roosting insectivores appearing on radar every day, we are able to describe this cumulative roosting activity by fitting a generalized additive model for each station year or roost year. Then we derived 6 phenological estimators, 10%, 25%, 50, 75, 90%, and percentile dates and mean date from this curve to describe different stages of the roosting activity. And here you are seeing all the cumulative roosting activity from all station years. With these estimators, then we are able to quantify the temporal trend of phenological patterns and interannual variations. Jumping into some results, we see that the number of roosting insectivores increased from late July, peak around August 16th, then disappear on the landscape in mid-September in the Great Lakes region. And here is the peak roosting activity date of all available years within one radar station, KAPX. And here we're seeing all the peak roosting activity dates in all radar stations. We see that the mean, which is this dark bar, are all circling around August 16th, but the variances of the peak roosting dates are varied a lot statistically. So then we asked, so if one station is earlier in this year, what other station gets earlier as well? So we calculated Pearson's correlation coefficients to examine the pairwise correlations between peak roosting activity dates at each station. A positive value means that they have positive and closely correlated peak roosting activity dates. And a non-significant 0 value means there are no significant correlation between the two. So overall, we find that the timing of events was positively correlated within each other at majority of the station, which is in blue. And we see that all significant correlations, which is denoted by bold font, were positive. So this great great within season synchrony of peak roosting activity dates is suggesting phenology is paced by a region-wide environmental cue. So overall, at Great Lake scale, we model roosting activity for each year, and you will see all years stacked together in the end. So my prediction was, as time goes on, the peak roosting activity date, which is the 50% passage day, is shifting earlier. This kind of phenology trend may be suggested in a lot of previous literature. And indeed, we find that over 21 years, aerial insectivore peak pre-migratory roosting approximately 2.26 days earlier per decade. And here you're seeing the same regression line in the previous slides. And here are all the phenological estimators. We see that 50%, 75%, 90%, and mean date are all showing significant advancing over the past 21 years, with a faster shift in later roosting stages. And earlier parts of the season, which is 10%, 25% passage day, did not show a significant trend, which could have resulted from non-uniform arrivals composed of different age groups, sex groups, and individuals coming from different breeding grounds or traveling at different pace. So this suggests that climate change impacts aerial insectivores' phenology shift unevenly across different periods of their roosting stage, potentially leading to a shortened pre-migratory roosting season. And next, we compared all phenology metrics, which is on the y-axis, to mean air temperature at the Great Lakes scale, which is on the x-axis. We see that in the Great Lakes region, regional daily mean temperature predicted 50% and 70% passage day, yet it is not a significant predictor for the other four phenology estimators. So in summary, while the initiation of long-distance migration is often regarded less flexible, our study shows that swallows and martins do display some phenotypic plasticity after leaving their breeding ground. And their ability to adapt to seasonal variation and by extension climate change may apply to the other periods of the non-breeding season. So in this research, we learned that this critical phenol phase is shifting earlier in the past 2 decades, approximately 2.26 days per decade for the peak roosting activity. And air temperature in the Great Lakes region was moderately predictive of changes in roosting timing. And the great within season synchrony of peak timing of roosting activity across station is suggesting that phenology is paced by a region-wide environmental cue, not fully described by air temperature alone. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'll take any questions you may have. We should have a little bit time.
Yes, we have 2 minutes. That was great, Hermione. So are there any questions? I don't see anything yet in the chat.
How do I stop sharing? Oh, it's I got it.
I think Kyle has raised his hand. So go ahead, Kyle. You can unmute yourself.
Sure, yeah, give you an insider question here. Just in terms of what you've presented, what's next for maybe what you're interested in?
Yeah, so as a classic sequence of study questions, we want to know when, where, and why. So now we observe this phenology shift phenomenon, and then we want to understand what is contributing to this phenology shift. So next step, we want to incorporate all kinds of environmental variables, for example, terrestrial and aquatic temperature, and hopefully aquatic insect phenology trend, and all the other environment variables. And also, we start from the Great Lakes region, but eventually we'll want to expand this roosting phenomenon in examination across the whole United States where they roost. And also eventually I will also do similar examination on Mexican free-tailed bats who also have this very amazing roosting phenomenon. Thank you, Kyle.
Any other questions? Okay, great. Thank you, Hermione.
This is Bob Fisher. I have a question, and it's out of ignorance. Does this study include other aerial insectivores?
Yeah, that's a key question for our research. So the area we're currently studying, like the Great Lakes region, are majorly we're looking at purple martin roost, but some roost in the northeast region, they're like mixed species. Sometimes it's like dominant by tree swallow. So we're still working on the species ID using weather surveillance radar.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, let's move on to our next speaker is Fengyi Gu, goes by Freda. She's from Princeton University in New Jersey, and she will be talking about autumn stopover hotspots and multi-scale habitat associations of migratory landbirds in the eastern US.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Can you hear me and see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Fengyi, also go by Freda. I'm a PhD student at Princeton University. And actually, 2 years ago, I attended the same conference, talked about what I plan to do with radar migration. And it feels great to be back 2 years later, presenting what I've actually done and some of the exciting results that are highly relevant to this community here. And of course, I should acknowledge my collaborators, Jeff and Jackie from UD, and my advisor, David from Princeton. So many of you have probably heard of the loss of 3 billion birds over the past 5 decades. And not surprisingly, the vast majority of them are migratory species due to their complicated life cycle. And historically, research and conservation efforts have predominantly focused on the breeding and wintering ground, whereas the en route migration period were less studied. However, population limiting factor can occur at any stage during this life cycle. And that's why we need full annual cycle perspective for conservation. And this is exactly why I'm interested in stopover sites, because there is a major knowledge gap about where are the important stopover sites. Land birds are particularly challenging to study because unlike waterfowls and shorebirds with distinctive staging area during stopover, land birds, as I'm sure many of you know, that tend to migrate diffusively and can occur at any place. So this shows that in order to figure out this important stopover sites, we need continental scale monitoring of bird migration. And this is beyond the capacity of typical field surveys or satellite, radio telemetry. And that's what brought I to radars. So this map shows the continental radar coverage of more than 100 radar stations. And each of the radar station actively samples the atmosphere every 5 to 10 minutes. So this kind of spatial and temporal coverage makes it an ideal tool for bird migration monitoring. So how does radar measure bird migration? Essentially, it's the same as it monitored precipitation, because all radar detects is the amount of reflective surface in the atmosphere. And each of the radar stations actively send out radio reflective signals to the atmosphere and can determine the size and density of the object in the air based on the amount of reflective signals received. So as ecologists, we also take raw data, but we actually remove all this precipitation that weather forecast people use, and the rest will be predominantly biology or bird in most cases. And I will explain more details how we do the stopover mapping in the later part of the presentation. So before we start looking for this hotspot, it is important to first define a hotspot. So they should, of course, support high density of migrants, but they also need to be consistent year by year, because very often we have limited conservation resources. And it is the loss of habitat that consistently support high density of migrants that could be more directly related to the population abundance change. So for this study, we chose the 60 radars in the eastern US as our study area, the region experiencing the sharpest population decline over the past few decades. And on the right, I'm plotting the polar base grade of each of the radar domain, and each of these finer grids, microgrids, will be pixels that I'm going to show you in the results. So how does radar actually map stopover density? So the key is also the synchronized exodus of land birds, which is kind of similar to what Hermione has described about the roosting pattern, except for the time difference. Because most passerines are nocturnal migrants, so they tend to take off in a synchronized way near sunset. And very often this kind of synchronized takeoff can be well captured by weather radars. So here, I'm showing you the animation of a radar domain near the Gulf of Mexico. And hopefully you can see, so the darker color shows higher density, and hopefully you can see that birds are taking off near the coastline at the beginning of the night and tend to disperse everywhere as time goes on. So in order to map the most accurate on-the-ground stopover density, timing is important here, because we don't want to sample it too early to miss most of the migration, but we also don't want to sample it too late, because otherwise birds are no longer where they take off from. That's why we apply this kind of dynamic sampling approach. So here I'm plotting the average aggregated reflectivity within a radar domain across time near sunset. And as you can see, at the beginning of the night, the reflectivity is generally low because there's not much going on. And as birds start to take off, we can see an increase in reflectivity. At some time point, there will be maximum change in reflectivity, representing the greatest amount of takeoff. And later in the evening, birds are dispersed everywhere. So we chose the inflection point as the sampling point to maximize the number of birds sampled while also minimize dispersion. So this then gives us the nightly stopover density for this particular radar at this night. And by stacking multiple nights available throughout a radar season, a migration season, we can then calculate the seasonal stopover density. And I repeat the same procedure for 5 years to assess interannual consistency. So in total, we used data from 60 radar stations over 5 autumn migration seasons, adding up to more than 3.5 million radar scans. So let's now look at the results. Here, I'm showing you the animation of the broad scale migration pattern with year markers shown on the upper left corner. And in all of the following figures I'm going to show you, the lighter color shows lower density and darker color shows higher density. So at the broad scale, you can probably tell that most of the radar stations are yellow to orange in color, showing similar stopover density, except for a few near the Appalachian Mountains in the east and Mississippi River on the west. So overall, this tends to confirm the common sense that land birds migration is broad front at a core scale. But once we zoom into the final base grid level, we do see some hotspot and hot stripes emerging as shown in this figure. Notice the difference in legend here, because here it's plotting much lower density than finer scale. And in the zooming panel, I'm showing you the high stopover density of migrants at the convergence of Ohio and Mississippi River. So this figure is actually averaging all 5 years of data together. But if you remember what I said before, interannual consistency is an important metric. So now I'm going to show you the yearly fine scale stopover density, and you can focus on any patch that looks interesting to you for interannual comparison. So this is year 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2019. So you can probably tell that there are indeed some interannual variation, but there are also hotspot and hot stripe that tend to be consistent year by year. And that's how we identify hotspot. So here we use the top 10 percentile threshold to identify high density pixels within each year. And by stacking 5 years of data together, we can then enumerate the number of years that each pixel is within the top 10 percentile for that year. And the pixels that are consistently supporting high density for 5 years, shown in dark green or black color here, are identified as hotspots. So now hopefully that the hotspots are easier for you to see. And the same zooming panel shows the large cluster of hotspots at the convergence of the two major rivers. So my next question then is, what are the important habitat characteristics for these hotspots identified? And for that, we built habitat model using an LCD land cover data. Considering that stopover density might be affected by habitat at multiple spatial scales, we also calculated land cover at 3 scales. At the local scale, we calculated proportional land cover within each radar pixel, which depends on the location, varies from 0.4 to 22 hectares. We also calculated landscape scale land cover feature by calculating the proportion within a 5-kilometer buffer of each radar pixel. At the broad scale, we calculated the land cover proportion within each radar domain, which is a 100-kilometer radius from the radar center. So throwing all this into a GAN model, we then generated some interesting results. So at the local scale, this is just a sample of all the land cover habitat associations we have examined. So on the left, we tend to find that stopover density increases with all types of deciduous for all types of forest cover. And here I'm showing you the example of deciduous forest cover. We also found that stopover density decreases with all types of agricultural land. And on the right, I'm showing you the example of the declining trend with cultivated crops. And there's more interesting pattern emerging after we consider multi-scale habitat interaction. So here on the x-axis, I'm plotting the landscape scale deciduous forest cover that is within 5-kilometer buffer of each pixel. And on the y-axis, I'm plotting the regional scale deciduous forest cover, the broader radar domain scale. And the color shows hotspot probability, with darker color shows higher probability of being a hotspot. So I want to draw your attention to the lower right corner here, because this is showing the highest hotspot probability in dense forest patches within broadly deforested regions. And I assume many of the forest remnants in the Midwest will be in situation like this. So this is showing a strong concentrating effects of forest fragments. And consider the broad geospatial scale of this study. We also built separate models for 3 different avifauna biomes, showing different background color here. So we have northern forest in blue, prairie land, Midwest agricultural land in yellow, and the eastern forest in green. So once I overlay these maps, I found something super interesting. So I tend to find lots of hotspots right at the boundary between the prairie land and eastern forest. So we then added additional covariates to the model by calculating the distance of pixels to the boundary of all pixels in the eastern forest biome and add that to the model. And this generates something also super interesting. So here I'm showing you the sharp decrease in both hotspot probability and stopover density as we get further away from the prairie biome. And this kind of 20-kilometer band of concentration, it's similar to what Jeff and co-authors have found near Gulf of Mexico, suggesting that the Midwest prairie might also be a migration barrier that birds are generally avoiding. And the reason for this kind of concentration at the boundaries is because after crossing a very wide migration barrier, many of the birds will be too exhausted or starved, and they have to stop whenever they see large continuous patches of forest. So to conclude, we found that at the core scale, line birds migrate across a broad front. This shows that we need we do need widespread locally based conservation efforts, and we cannot only focus on a few states. We also highlight stopover hotspot that we found using radars, and this deserves particular attention to those locally based conservation efforts. We also want to highlight that forest fragments in broadly deforested regions are highly likely to be stopover hotspot, and those should also receive greater attention. And lastly, we found that agricultural Midwest could be a human-created migration barrier, which further emphasizes on the importance of conservation and restoration efforts within this region to build enough stepping stones for birds to overcome the barrier. So with that, I would like to thank my funding, my research assistant, and my lab, and thank you all for listening.
Okay, that was great. Are there any questions? Maybe a quick question.
Rita, I have a question. This is Sarah Kendrick with the Fish and Wildlife Service. I was wondering, in all of your research and lit review, what do you personally suggest or think that we should do conservation-wise on the ground in these hotspot areas if we happen to be in one?
I think that's a great question. So this actually brings two of my thoughts. One is, if you happen to in one of the hotspots that I identified, of course, we should protect the remaining habitat, especially if those are like the forest fragments in broadly deforested regions, as in the Midwest. And very often people tend to kind of overlook those small forest patches because we tend to think that birds are not really breeding in that part. But in terms of like supporting high migrant density during the migration season, these are very important. And the other thing is, like, I also want to highlight that in the map I showed, I've only mapped a portion of the entire United States because radar has limited coverage. So there might be areas that I haven't mapped, which can also be hotspots. And I'm sure that Kyle will talk about it in the following presentation.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay.
This is Bob Fisher again. The two Mississippi River hotspots, I think I'm reading the map correctly. Those are both at the confluence of other major rivers, the Ohio and the Missouri coming in. Does that suggest perhaps that I guess the floodplain forest there is really important?
Yes, indeed. I didn't show the results for the, as you said, flood, what's that called? The riverine hardwood. What's that? Let me find the terminology.
Bottomland forest, yeah.
Yes, the woody wetland, because both stopover hotspot probability and stopover density also increases with woody wetland cover. So indeed, those convergence of rivers are very important.
So that would be a very specific area to focus on in terms of, you might say, preservation and habitat enhancement.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll need to move on, but maybe we can have folks stay later at the end to ask questions if there are more questions for Freda. So our next speaker is going to be Kyle Horton, who is at Colorado State University, and he'll be keeping on this stopover mapping theme, modeling avian seasonal stopover distributions across the contiguous US using radar data. And I think Kyle's presentation is pre-recorded. So
yeah, thanks everyone. We've got construction at our house, so I didn't want to risk it. So I've got this talk, and then I'd be happy to take questions live after the fact.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Kyle Horton. I'm an assistant professor at Colorado State University, and I'm tuning in from Fort Collins, Colorado. My title today is entitled Modeling Avian Stopover Distributions Across the Contiguous United States Using Radar Data. Before I jump into this exciting work, I just want to acknowledge the series of co-authors here at the bottom of the screen and the universities represented in this work. Folks from the University of Delaware, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, University of Massachusetts, Princeton University, and Michigan State University. This work really isn't possible without the efforts of these collaborators and co-authors, so I just want to take a moment to acknowledge their contributions. To start, I wanted to use this schematic here of trying to understand what we're tackling with this research and how we're using radar data to quantify the distributions of migratory birds at such large scales. Migratory birds will progress north and south, the vast majority of them flying under the cover of darkness. So they'll fly through the night, but ultimately settle into a terrestrial landscape for much of the day. So they may move into areas like forested patches or even urban parks or urban development in some cases. But where the action really happens in terms of migration is as the sun sets. And as these birds lift off around sunset, we have the fortune of having a radar network across the United States, about 143 radars that are sampling airspaces every 5 and 10 minutes. And we can use that sampling approach to cue in on the initiation of migration, linking the exodus from terrestrial into those airspaces to quantify migration activity. So I want to use this depiction here. This is a series of radar data from the night of April 23rd, 2020. And what you're going to see is at this radar that's collecting these data in southern Florida of the United States. And as the sun sets, migrants are going to take off of the landscape. You're going to see this, birds coming off of these islands. They'll head north on their spring migration journey. And then there'll be a secondary wave of migrants that are coming through the airspaces from Cuba. So on this given night, this is not a small number of birds. This is likely hundreds of thousands, if not millions of birds moving through these airspaces of many diverse species coming through this area. So this really points to a powerful tool for this quantification. And we don't just get data from one radar data or from one night, but we can look at around 100 plus radars getting scans every 5 and 10 minutes across now multiple decades. So the question of this talk today, and the focus of my talk, is can we map migrant stopover locations across the contiguous United States to learn spatial drivers? And the question here isn't can radar data be used for this question, it's whether or not we can scale it up to such large scales in this new approach. So our approach to tackle this problem was to look at both seasons of migration, spring and fall, and that's how we define this here. And then we selected radar scans that would optimally capture the migration initiation. So we looked at around 2.5 hours after local sunset, and then extracted specific scans that maximize the rate of increase of activity into those airspaces. We would then take radar data from 142 locations. We ultimately dropped one because it had pretty severe bat contamination. But in the end, we were left with a very large sample size, and we focused for this study on the more recent 5 years, 2016 to 2020. And then we used a unique modeling approach where we didn't just make one model across the United States, whereas we assembled thousands of models to learn the associations of migration activity with spatial or terrestrial drivers on the landscape. So what this looks like is we would capture a radar scan for a given night. We'd do the same process for the next night, the next night. In some cases, we would have to remove data because they are contaminated. In this case, something like weather contamination or precipitation. And we would assemble these scans for any given site for a season. We'd have around 93 nights of data. And we could amass those into an aggregate measure of a mean exodus activity or migration activity. So this is for one radar for 1 year in this instance. And that one radar is here. It would look like this small disk. Across the US, it would look something like this. So these are the measurements for the fall of 2020. Again, we looked at 5 years of data for spring and for fall. So then the next challenge here was to link all of these radar measures of bird migration activity with known drivers of migration activity. So things like land cover types, or vegetative indices, or temperature regimes, or precipitation, or even anthropogenic disturbances like light pollution. In total, we used around 50 predictors following these suite of categories. So things like the year as being an effect, or distance to radar, or elevation, and then a whole cadre of spatial predictors in land cover types. So our modeling approach, like I said, wasn't just one global model, but rather small spatial subsets. Small being a relative term here, these are still large spatial models. So for instance, we might look at data just from this small box or this subset of this geographic area in southern Texas. And we might look at this subset of data in Arizona and California, and so on and so forth. And over time, we would assemble all of these models. In the end, we assembled 2,500 unique models. In some areas, we would get redundant models that would have some areas sampled more than once. And what we could do is learn the associations specifically in different spatial areas. We could amass those redundant measurements and get an average of the predicted activity in each of these 2,500 spatial subsets. And we did this for spring and for fall. So maybe the first question is, well, how well do these models perform in the areas that we actually have data? So what we wanted to do is make sure we were confident that our models would be able to predict into the areas that the radar isn't sampling. There's many areas across the US that we don't get good radar coverage, but we also want to make predictions into those areas. So what we did is within the areas that we do have radar data, we would hold out some data. And then we would make a prediction into those areas that we held out to understand how well would we make predictions into the areas across the US that we don't have access to data, or the radars simply don't cover those areas. And what we found is that we had really good predictive performance. In the spring, around 85% of the variance was captured. In the fall, slightly higher. So both in spring and fall, we're making really good confident predictions. On the x-axis here is the predicted migrant density. And on the y-axis for both seasons was the actual migrant density as measured by the radars. Okay, so this is what we actually find from our models. So you remember previously we had 142 circular disks of data. Now we've filled in all of those gaps from this modeling framework to get a continuous surface of migrant density across the lower 48 states. And in this case, this is a prediction for spring of 2020. And this is a prediction now for the spring or for the fall of 2020. And at this scale, it's hard to really understand and appreciate the granularity of these predictions. These models are making predictions at 1 kilometer resolution across the lower 48. So we can zoom into an area like this to better appreciate the heterogeneity on this landscape. So here, what we can see is zooming into this Midwest region, we get some hotspots of migration activity as represented by the yellow colors and some cool spots as represented by the purples and blues here. And without some context of what does the underlying landscape look like, it's hard to understand why there are hot spots and cool spots. But when we lay these side by some underlying land cover types, we have developed area in the top left, agriculture in the bottom left, and percent forest cover in the top right here, and stopover density in the bottom right. We can see visually, we can see positive associations with percent canopy cover or forest cover as the green spots in the top right, and general avoidance of agricultural areas as shown in the bottom left here. One of the really interesting things about these maps is that we can also look at now seasonal differences in migration density across the United States. Are there areas in the lower 48 where we see more spring migrants than fall migrants, and vice versa? We would generally predict that we would see more migrants probably across the board in the fall as we're seeing the net productivity of breeding output. But that's not, in fact, what we see. We see more migrants utilizing the Gulf of Mexico region in the spring. We see more migrants utilizing the Western Flyway in parts like Arizona, California, Oregon, and Washington in the spring. And then across the Eastern United States, tremendously more activity in those areas as represented by the blue colors on this map. And then one of the really exciting things now, what we can do is state by state across the lower 48, we can define hotspots in these regions. So extracting all of the data, for instance, from Texas, we could then categorize all of those areas and then define these in some groups here. So red being hotspots as defined by these definitions here. Yellows as sort of a medium migration activity, and then the grays denoted as low migration activity. And we could zoom into some areas. So we can see really strong hotspots in the spring around the Gulf of Mexico, as in many ways expected. We can see these hotspots in the fall as well. So just to conclude and wrap up, can we map migrant stopover locations across the contiguous United States to learn spatial drivers? I'd say confidently yes to that question. And then the next questions that we have in front of us are, how are stopover patterns actually changing? We've looked at 5 years of data. We can now look at within those 5 years or across multiple decades now with this framework. We can say, how are emerging data sets, how can they be used to inform and aid stopover patterns, integrating things like community science data or advanced remote sensing data to elevate and expand on these models as well. So I'll just wrap up there. Again, I'd like to thank my co-authors and then thank the funding agencies that have supported this work. The National Science Foundation and NASA has greatly supported this work over the last couple of years. So thank you so much, and I appreciate your attention.
Okay. So for sake of time, I think we're gonna move on, Kyle, if that's okay, because we are a few minutes here behind schedule. But that was a great presentation, and if you, like I said, you can put questions in the chat, and maybe there can be some chat discussion. So our next speaker is Raphael Nussbaumer, who is at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and he will be talking about remapping bird density from weather radar data as an inverse problem. So take it away, Raphael. Looks good.
Is it working? Yeah. Oh, cool. Perfect. Well, thanks very much for this opportunity to be able to present a bit some of my ongoing work, where we try to get a more accurate estimation of the bird density in 3 dimensions within the polar volume. And so our main goal is really to remap the raw data from weather radar in the spherical coordinate into a regular Cartesian grid in 3D, while accounting for the beam geometry. And we are basically tackling this challenge by formulating the measurement process of the weather radar as a linear problem, and then computing the inverse problem, the inverse solution of that problem. So let's start by looking at describing 4 main considerations of the beam geometry. Firstly, because of the Earth curvature, the height of the beam increases actually with the range that is the distance from the radar. And it's actually more convenient to correct the beam height by using a flat Earth reference. And this effect may result in a nonlinear beam shape with a large volume that is not measured close to the ground. Secondly, because the angle is fixed, the beam width increases with the range, resulting also in an increase of the volume sample. And this results mainly in a smooth and more homogeneous data at longer range. And thirdly, the electromagnetic power of the beam reduces exponentially from the center of the beam. And as a result, bird density is not homogeneously sampled across the space. And there is no fixed limit really to that volume, such that consecutive measurements actually sample overlapping volumes. And finally, we assume that the bird density is sufficiently high with respect to the volume sample. So we won't really address this issue here, but I think it's one to keep in mind. So how do we account for all of these effects? It's actually relatively easy to account for them while building the forward mapping of this problem. That is, if we assume that we actually know the true density on this Cartesian grid, we can model what the measurement would look like on the spherical grid. So let's see how we can build the forward mapping for this 2D example, looking from above, and the center here is the weather radar. For these particular measurements in gray here. So the forward mapping links the measurement from the grid square, for instance, this 4 grid square, into the measurements. And for an homogeneous case, this mapping is basically the weighted average of each of them by the volume that they overlaps. However, as described earlier, this measurement is actually not defined in a fixed uniform volume, but rather by a power function of the beam, something like this. But the mapping remains essentially the same. That is, we can compute the integral of the power function overlapping each of these squares. But because of the weird shape of the beam described earlier, and for the computational reason, it's actually easier to approximate this integration with a discretization. And this is basically what we are doing, but in 3D. So note that the relative size of the measurement volume and the grid square varies tremendously with the range, that is the distance from the radar, and that we actually compute that in 3D. So the forward mapping that we have just described allows us to get from the true density in a 3D Cartesian grid, such as this one, into the observed density that is measured by the weather radar. And mathematically, this formulation is basically a weighted function. Is this weighting function f that is a linear matrix operation. And therefore, the reverse operation is known as the inverse problem and is equivalent to the remapping from the polar coordinate of the raw weather radar into a Cartesian grid. However, this reverse operation...
I don't know what happens if they don't make it in. Then there's...
However, this reverse operation is much more challenging because this linear system is typically ill-posed with multiple solutions matching the observation. Intuitively, you can think of the bottom corner of the volume where there is no measurement, and therefore any density in the true density could be theoretically possible. In such case, solving the inverse problem is typically solved with a regularization, which add constraint on the system based on expert knowledge. And so in our case, we are actually using two regularization, one forcing a vertical profile of reflectivity, and a second one forcing a smoothness in our data. So I'll go a bit quickly on how to compute this, but basically the linear inversion is solved by minimizing an objective function, phi, which included these three terms. So the first one is the observation mismatch. The second one is matching the vertical profile, and finally the smoothness term. And in this equation, the alpha parameter basically defines the relative strength of each of these regularization terms. And so the optimization problem is solved with a least square problem. It's an iterative solver which can deal with very large sparse matrix. So let's look at a case study with a departure flight from early in the night in Chicago. And as a preliminary note, I just wanted to point out that this figure actually shows reflectivity factor, which is a log scale of bird density. And as such, this figure gives a sort of wrong sense of smoothness. So this is the solution from the inversion with this 3D remapping of the bird density. And to illustrate, we can extract like the cross section along the x-axis that you can see here, and I'm overlapping scatter points of the original measurements that you can see here, and that shows how the inverted density actually matches really well the observation at their specific location when you can see them. And here is the cross section along the other axis. And we can also take slides of the XY plane to inspect the density at various elevation. So at 200 meter elevation, 400, 800, and 1,000 meter, with density generally diminishing with the height. But you can see how the density at location where there is no measurement is going towards the reference to the vertical profile. And so finally, we can take a look at different vertical profiles, so sample randomly across the volume, and we can compare this vertical profile at different location with the inverted VPR in blue. And you can see how basically this method allow essentially to examine the assumption of a constant vertical profile by assuming a vertical profile where there's no data and then moving back to the real data where there are data to constrain it. And so I'll highlight I finished by highlight two main advantages of this approach. The first one is that the formulation is highly flexible with multiple regularization possible. And as an example, we can account for like coastal effects by removing the smoothness on the coast and by forcing the VPR to be only on the coast. And this is the resulting inversion for the density integrated over altitude. And so the flip side of this flexibility is that it actually requires a lot of fine tunings and of multiple parameters. And the formulation of this regularization needs a very good understanding of the spatial distribution of bird. The second advantage is the ability to combine multiple radar into the same system and creating a mosaic of weather radar. And here is an example for 5 weather radar. And so we can integrate the density over altitude to show a better spatial coverage. And in this inversion, I'm actually inverting one VPR per radar. You can see in a solid color. And you can see how basically all the vertical profile in between weather radar will sort of transfer from one to another vertical profile, depending on the distance from the radar. And so with this, I'll finish by thanking for your attention, and I'm glad to receive any question.
Okay, that was great, Raphael. I'm excited by this new method of maybe even resolving, like you said, how these different vertical profiles and assessing that assumption of homogeneity of those across the radar domain. So exciting stuff. Are there any questions? We could take a quick question. Okay. Well, let's see. I guess we will move on. Thanks again, Raphael. And our next speaker is Zach Gack, who is from the University of Windsor in Ontario, Canada, and he will be presenting on using flight calls to study the ecology of actively migrating songbirds in the Upper Great Lakes region. So we're moving on to some acoustic studies. And I'm not sure, Zach, if you can share your screen.
Yeah, I'll try now. Yeah, this is pre-recorded because my internet isn't great here and I wanted Jeff to have a copy. But anyway, I'll try now.
Okay. Oh yeah, it's coming through.
I'm excited to talk about my research on wood warbler flight calls and how we can use flight calls to understand the ecology of migratory birds as they fly overhead. Migration is a widespread phenomenon in nature, occurring in diverse taxonomic groups, such as these shown here. We often tend to think about migration as occurring in these large single species movements, but how often multiple species migrate together and communicate during migration is more poorly known. Songbirds are one such example that migrate in interspecific groups, and these social species might benefit from having some way of staying in contact with each other to avoid predators, to navigate dangerous crossings, and to locate stopover habitat. One way migratory birds might stay in contact with other individuals is by producing flight calls. Flight calls are short, species-specific vocalizations produced during migration that are generally between 40 to 300 milliseconds in length and around 6 to 11 kilohertz in frequency, so they're fairly high-pitched. The wood warbler flight calls shown here in red above each bird, which I focused on, you can see there's a wide range of acoustic variation in calls between species, with some species having similar calls and others having very different calls. So these flight calls can be classified into three main categories. There are others, but we'll focus on these three, such as the zeep calls on the left, which consist of buzzy calls with distinct frequency peaks, the upsweeps, which increase over time, and the downsweeps, which decrease over time. We currently don't know why species in these groups sound similar, and we still don't have a great understanding of the reasons birds produce flight calls during migration. So one hypothesis for the function of flight calls is mentioned in a paper by Hamilton from 1962. As he says, we should anticipate strong selective pressures for flocking mechanisms in species traveling long distances. And as we've become more familiar with the night callers, it will be interesting to see if these interspecific flocks show adaptive groupings of species with directionally similar goals. So I was pretty interested in this, and so I wanted to build on these ideas. And the overall question I was interested in throughout my PhD was whether similar flight calls are acoustic signals that migratory birds use to identify individuals that they share migratory journeys with. In detail, I was curious whether overlap of warbler species in migration might drive the evolution of acoustically similar flight calls, so that migrants can use similar calls to seek out individuals with the same migration route. An example of this is shown here for the Connecticut blackpoll and Blackburnian warblers at the top, all with very similar zeep calls and long-distance South American wintering grounds. So I wanted to investigate if similarity in migration route and timing was correlated with acoustic similarity of warbler flight calls. This might imply that similar flight calls may have evolved in species that overlap in migration because they are used as in-flight indicators of shared migration routes, and there's a benefit to traveling with similar individuals in migration. This isn't a perfect fit, though, because as you see these individuals on the bottom, they do have more diverse migration routes, but they don't have convergence in calls. But I wanted to investigate this across this group of species. So the first step in examining whether warblers with similar migrations have acoustically similar calls was to first find out how acoustically similar each warbler species was to the next species. To do this, I took a data set of 864 flight calls of 36 species, like the one shown here, and measured 17 acoustic measurements for each call. Once I had the same measurements of each flight call, I performed a principal components analysis and then plotted each species in acoustic space. To find out how acoustically similar each species was, I measured the distance between each pair of species so that I had a similarity value for each pair of warblers. So then, to see if similarity in migration was correlated with having similar flight calls, I took a data set of the 36 warbler species ranges during migration and measured 7 migration metrics derived from NatureServe and eBird to determine how much each possible species pair of the 36 warblers, like these Connecticut and Blackpoll shown here, overlap in migration. So then I next used Mantell tests to examine whether similarity in migration is in fact correlated with acoustic similarity of wood warbler flight calls, while also controlling for phylogenetic relatedness, because we would expect that more similar, closely related species should have more similar calls. So what we see is that for all 36 species of warblers in the analysis, warblers that were phylogenetically more similar had more similar flight calls, as shown in the graph on the left, and warblers with more similar breeding latitudes had more similar flight calls, as shown on the graph in the graph on the right. So then, looking at the results for timing of migration, we also found that as warblers overlapped more in the timing of their May migrations, the more similar their flight calls were. So overall, these results suggest that warblers with similar migrations do have similar flight calls across the group of 36 species. This also potentially suggests that similarity in flight calls may have evolved because it is beneficial to migrate with individuals that have the same general route and timing of migration. This also indirectly implies that flight calls may function as signals birds use in flight to locate other migrants that it is beneficial to migrate with. We now want to build on this work and look at whether warblers with similar migrations within some of these categories, like the Zeep complex, evolve these similar calls through a process of parallel evolution. So, but the next part of my research that I'll focus on here, I wanted to study the behavior of birds in active migration and to see if warblers with similar flight calls actually associate, as our previous research that I just presented indicated. To do this, I developed a microphone array consisting of a grid of 8 microphones with microphones mounted at the top and bottom of 7-meter poles shown in the upper left that I could use to triangulate the positions of calling warblers and study their behavior as they flew overhead. Arrays have been widely used to study the behavior of terrestrial and arboreal birds, but they haven't really been used as much for studying birds in active migration, because we needed to see if this could actually be done. In this work, we were able to demonstrate that we could triangulate the position of calling warblers with high accuracy around 2.7 meters, which is similar to most ground-based triangulation studies, and use it to differentiate individuals in many cases. And then to apply this technique to study the behavior of entire flocks. So the study site for setting up the array was the Keweenaw Peninsula, which extends about 80 kilometers into Lake Superior from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, denoted by the red arrow in the inset graph. This site is ideal for recording flocks of migratory birds because the westerly winds across Lake Superior cause migratory birds crossing the lake to drift off course. These migrants then reorient to the nearest land and fly west along the coast in large morning movements to compensate for the drift they experienced the night before. It's not uncommon to observe over 6,000 individuals flying overhead in just a couple hours, which made an ideal location to position the microphone array directly under these birds' flight path. So what we are now working on is using the array to triangulate entire flocks of active migrant warblers and then to directly examine whether warblers with acoustically similar flight calls associate and migrate in closer proximity to each other than warblers with dissimilar calls. So if flight calls are in fact important in flock assembly, this would be represented by the schematic shown here, where birds on the left with highly similar flight calls would fly in close proximity, whereas the birds on the right, which have more dissimilar calls, would not really associate or more loosely associate. This research is preliminary, but I just wanted to mention that we are finding that both acoustic similarity of flight calls and overall migrant group diversity, the number of species in that group, predict the proximity with which actively migrating warblers fly to each other. In the future, though, we'd like to follow up with more detailed species-specific analyses. So on a broader scale, I think flight calls are underutilized for migration monitoring, but offer a wealth of information which could be applied to study species migration patterns, timing, and potentially shifts in individual species phenology due to climate change at a very fine taxonomic scale, because we can identify these to species in many cases, these as they fly overhead. In the future, I have talked with a few people about plans to implement a migration monitoring network of flight call recorders throughout North America, which is very ambitious, but could report near real-time information on the species passing over and would use Cornell's advances in automated flight call classification. And these data would be publicly available, similar to eBird data or Birdcast. Once we start accumulating large amounts of flight call data from a wide range of geographic areas, I think much more can be done to use flight calls to produce better migration monitoring estimates, which can't be captured with radar or band or ground-based data as these birds fly overhead. And so with that, I would like to thank all of these wonderful people and thank you for listening. Thank you.
Okay, that was great, Zach. Do we have time? We have time for one question. Sorry, we're hitting you with all these talks and not leaving enough room for questions, but there's just so much interesting stuff happening. I want everyone to share their findings with you all. Okay, so there is a question in the chat from Dustin. Interesting work, Zach. Are flight calls indistinguishable based on your measures between any of the species you studied?
So if I understand it, I think he's asking like how similar some of these calls are. And yes, some of these species, especially that Zeep group that I mentioned, are extremely similar between species, and even experts struggle to separate them. But I think trained ears can separate them, at least, really sometimes. And so I think, Cornell, I've talked to some people there, and they're working on inputting these call libraries into the Merlin sound ID algorithm. And so I think that it can be done, at least for calls that are, optimum. And so I think it can, I think it can be done for a lot of species in the future. Yeah, we certainly can go a lot farther than we are now, than we have gone now.
Okay, great. Thanks, Zach. So we'll move on to our last speaker for today's session is Christina Coleman, who is at the University of Oklahoma, and she will be talking about courtship ground soundscapes of the American woodcock.
Get a little ahead of myself. Okay, can everyone see the screen right?
Yes, looks good.
Awesome. All right, so thanks for the introduction, Jeff. I'm Christina, and I'm going to be presenting today my first field season work, which tried to capture some soundscape dynamics of American woodcock courtship grounds. So if you're not familiar with the American woodcock courtship flight, these birds fly in a cylinder upwards of around 300 feet and then descend in a swooping motion, all while their outer primary feathers produce a twittering noise. And while this is very complex and different for the Scolopax group, we do know that they choose courtship grounds based on their main diet component being earthworms, female nests and female nest proximity. But I wondered, do woodcock choose courtship grounds based on the sound properties within them? So the majority of woodcock studies focus on increasing production via fecundity for hunting purposes, but I believe promoting and encouraging the courtship flight performance is more of an overlooked step in the process and very much so worth investigating. So to assess these soundscape properties in courtship grounds, I obtained some audio moths, which are the sound recorders you see on top. They were placed throughout Western New York this past May. And you can see on the map that I have a bunch of different microphones. These are my sites that I was able to get permission to go on. So I have 8 different sites. The microphones are differently colored based on if I have confirmed occurrences or not. The yellow microphones are not confirmed occurrences, and the orange ones is when I did capture woodcock courtship performances. So with these audio moths, another student in the Eli Bridges lab, Millen Pundit, actually created a structure to house them made of plexiglass, which changes the collection of sound data from 180 degrees in front of it to 360 degrees. It is fantastic. You can just put them straight on stakes out in the wilderness, and you can see I am activating the recorder with my phone. AudioMoth has apps on your phone so that you can produce a chime, and it will configure the AudioMoth based on the types of recording schedules that you have set. So I put these out for 1 week at a time, and I set them to record at dusk and at dawn, since American woodcock are crepuscular, but typically perform their flights at night. Once I had all of this data, I had over 70,000 minutes just from the month of May from my sites. So I used the website Arbamon, which collaborated with Rainforest Connection to analyze a bunch of these audio files. I was able to target match based on the species that I had and create templates that I can use in the future to go back and species match more of the recordings once I collect them. So I highly recommend this website if you are looking for ways to process your data. From my results, I mentioned I had 2 occurrences. The first one being in the most urban site that I had. This site is in the middle of Buffalo. It's surrounded by a highway on one side and a very active rail yard on the other. On top of it being in the city and with all of this noise, it has a high amount of human traffic of people trying to get out into nature and relax. For the actual detection that I had, it was in more of the meadow area of this location. I also had another group set out closer to the pond, but I did not detect any there. My second confirmed site was in a very rural area of Western New York. It was my unknown site. So I paired these sites based on past occurrence records. So I had 1 known and 1 unknown. This rural site, assumingly, had lower anthropogenic noise. And based on the preserve staff, it had a lot less traffic, around 10 people per month. I was able to put these audio moths out too in early successional forests, which is the typical habitat for woodcock. So now to analyze my data. I have one type of results due to how many data files I have and how long it takes to run them. So my sound files were analyzed in R using sound ecology function, and using the sound ecology package and the function, the normalized difference soundscape index, or the NDSI. This tells us whether there is more anthropogenic noise or biological noise in the recordings based on the frequency bands, and creates a ratio from +1 to -1 based on the presence of those two sounds. I compared 6 types of sites, so my known versus my unknown sites, my urban versus my rural sites, and my dawn versus my dusk times. I will be performing more of the indices of the sound ecology package, but given that I had 70,000 minutes of data in chunks of about 40,000, these ran for 5 to 8 hours each. So the following graphs you'll see took a lot of time. I hope they are clear. And here's the first one. So this comparison is my known versus my unknown sites. I had 4 known sites and 4 unknown sites. This is the most even category just on site classification. On the y-axis, we can see that ratio that I mentioned before, and I indicated both the dawn and the dusk times. So all of these plots are scatter plots with a violin plot placed on top of it so that we can see the abundance of those NDSI scores. So here we can see that in our known sites, we had much more biophony, much more biologic noise, meaning there is more points at the top of the ratio. Whereas in our unknown site, it's pretty even. You will notice though a little divot at the bottom in the anthropogenic section. So there is a slight skew towards biologic noise. In my urban versus rural sites, I had 3 urban sites and 5 rural sites, although 2 of those rural sites are considered more suburban. So with the same ratio that we had before, we can see in the urban site, it had so much more anthropogenic noise based on the violin plot width at the bottom of the y-axis towards the -1. Much more than the rural site, it almost had none. When I looked back through the recordings, there was 1 car that went through at all of the rural sites at night, especially. And my last comparison is my dawn versus dusk recordings. So we have more sections of time here, which are labeled based on the hours they are within. So for instance, the first light tan column is 4 a.m. to 5 a.m. So we can see here in the dawn recordings, we have much more biologic noise than we do anthropogenic noise. And at dusk, we have slightly more biologic noise, but it does have a good mix of anthropogenic noise as well. So finally, I'm trying to go a little fast to keep us back on time, but the conclusions to this, my first field season, is that these soundscapes differed based on the classification of the site and the time of day. So for Woodcock courtship grounds, the known sites, which have annual occurrences of at least the past 5 years, had more biologic noise at dawn and dusk. And earlier I mentioned that woodcock are crepuscular, but typically they court at night. I do need to redo this study during peak breeding season, but my results suggest that woodcock are courting in areas with less noise competition overall of both the biologic and anthropogenic noise. And just some recommendations, since there are a lot of conservation managers here. This was acoustically monitoring sites with ARUs, or autonomic recording units. It's an easy way to assess biologic noise, geographical noise, and anthropogenic noise. The geologic is noise such as weather, like rain and wind. Although this analysis has been very time-consuming and computationally intensive. So if you don't have a computer that can run it efficiently, you will run into problems just with timing and analyses. For the future, I mentioned this was my first field season, so I have a lot more plans. The NDSI function in the sound ecology package is just one of 6 options. So they also have acoustic complexity, diversity, evenness, entropy, and bioacoustic index as a whole. So I'm hoping to run the rest of those functions. I'm also hoping that I can capture the annual cycle of soundscapes throughout their breeding season, at their stopover sites, and in wintering grounds along the Gulf Coast. In addition, I really hope to use BirdNet's automated species identification to identify other bird species that frequent in the same areas. There's a few studies that suggest woodcock are umbrella species for golden wing warblers in particular, and I'd like to confirm those findings. Finally, I hope that I can distinguish regional and individual variation of male vocalizations in particular. There is a cross-correlation function similar to what Zach mentioned before, where you can tell the differences between those vocalizations of individuals, and you can also tell it across regional discrepancies. So I hope to do these in the future. I want to thank all of the land owners that let me go on there, and especially Rainforest Connection for all the support they provided. On top of, thank you, Jeff, for inviting me here. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Christina. That's really interesting research. Are there any questions for Christina? I have a question. So a noise assessment that you're doing, that's just a broad scale across all frequencies, or are you also doing an analysis where you're just looking at noise, perhaps in the frequency range at which the woodcocks are making their courtship calls?
For this analysis, it was all frequency ranges, but yes, I am going to look into just noise competition within woodcock frequencies as well.
Great. Other questions? So I want to thank all the speakers, and I do want to, there may be interest in asking presenters questions here, but for those folks that may need have other commitments, I want to respect their time so we can sort of close out the session. But if folks are wanting to stay on for a few more minutes, if presenters are willing to stick around to field some more questions, that would be great. So thank you all for attending the meeting today. We do have next week, same time, we're going to have the Telemetry Initiative meeting. So Sarah Kendrick's going to lead that session, so you can hear more about the Modus Station network across the Midwest. And yeah, thank you all for joining today, and thank you for the speakers. This is all really great research, and it's very exciting to see what's coming down the pipeline. And I think, Kyle, there's a lot of interest for folks to get access to those maps that you're starting to generate. So hopefully that will start to come out here soon. So thanks again. And like I said, if there's any questions, folks feel free to drop out, but if there are any questions, I'll just open the floor for questions.
Jeff, I have a question. This is Sarah.
Yeah.
How do you see all of this radar work kind of coming together across our initiatives with Modus and banding and tagging? I know we need to get together on that, but what are some of your high level ideas as we kind of synthesize all this information?
I think, well, so for Freda's project, I think there might be some nice integration there in, we're finding this interesting pattern. The radar is good at looking at these very broad scale patterns, although we can map things very finely. So there's some great information coming out of these mapping efforts. And I think that creates more questions to be asking. So, Freda's got this hypothesis that the the prairie biome may be acting as a migration barrier, at least from the perspective of these forest migrants that are congregating near the edge of the biome. So it would be great to then reach out to the banding initiative to see, you know, where are there banding stations on the ground where we could ask more probing questions to really see how birds may be behaving at a very local scale in response, you know, on the edge of this barrier. Hopefully it can also help inform maybe where folks might want to be doing field work on the ground, like identifying these hotspot areas and maybe helping to focus where people can do research. I don't know if anybody else has other ideas.
This is Bob Fisher again. Just, is it really appropriate to define it as a prairie biome? I mean, in a historical sense it is, but really it's more of an agricultural biome now.
Sure.
Yeah, that's a good point. I kept the biome name as it is in the shapefile, but I always want to highlight that it's more of an agricultural dominated landscape than prairie.
I'm wondering too, Jeff, if once we've identified these hotspots more thoroughly, if you and I can get together to have like a targeted webinar maybe in the future to talk about MODIS station placement in those locations. And I know it's just around existing radar, so it's not across the entire land cover to identify those sites, and especially the heaviest hotspots, it may make sense for placement there, at least try.
Yeah, it would be great to do some sort of integrated data collection where we've got different sort of methods going on. Like Zach had mentioned, you know, putting out a network of acoustic recorders, pairing them up with MODIS towers, putting them in places that are observed by radar. These are all great ideas. And, you know, questions like that Sergio's project is sort of exposing, you know, thinking about these aerial threatscapes, and that might generate some questions that other initiative groups might be able to tackle sort of more locally. So yeah, I think there's great potential in how we integrate these things, and we're just starting to really do this or think about this more seriously. So
Lots of cool stuff going on. Thanks, everybody.
Are there other questions? Okay. Well, great. Thanks again for everybody's time. And I don't necessarily want to speak on behalf of the presenters, but I'm sure if you reached out to them with questions, they'd be happy to answer. So, okay, we'll see you all. Hopefully see you all again next week for the next session. Take care.